Number 5. Braemars Tight Squeeze. A second passage of Greece's 4-mile-long Corinth Canal is being planned by Fred Olsen Cruise Lines to promote more trips in the UK. Passengers will experience a once-in-a-lifetime adventure as the largest ship to ever travel across the 130-year-old canal with just 2.5 feet of clearance at the passage's narrowest points. The Braemar cruise ship made history in 2019. The cruise line intends to recreate the record-breaking navigation so travelers can relive history. The journey is planned for May 14, 2023. The tense trip, which would require at least 2 years to organize, was first scheduled for April 2023. The ship got tugboat assistance to help it avoid any bumps in 2019. With such a tight squeeze, onboard passengers were sometimes even able to touch the canal's walls. The 642-long-foot Braemar exceeds the typical size of ships allowed to travel through the ancient waterway, even though boats have been passing through since 1893. Typically, the authorities only allow access to ships with beams shorter than 58 feet. Braemar making it through the canal by a hair is certainly impressive. But some canals and ships aren't as lucky. On March 13, 2022, the Ever Forward, which spanned the lengths of 3 football fields, was on its way to Norfolk, Virginia from the port of Baltimore when it got stuck in the Chesapeake Bay. It settled in for well over a month despite many rescue attempts. The tanker was filled with roughly 5,000 containers, and salvage experts assessed that they wouldn't be able to withstand its ground force. The first try at rescuing the ship was made when workers tried pushing it away from the sandbank and into deeper water. They used 5 tugs and 2 moored pulling barges. The tugs tried moving the ship's port, starboard, and while the barges linked to Ever Forward's back acted as an anchor. That didn't work though. A week later they tried again. This time they lightened the burden on the Ever Forward by removing some of the containers on board. After removing about 500 containers, crew pulled the tugboats once more. The Ever Forward was finally released with the help of 5 tugboats and 2 large barges. According to officials, there have been no complaints of injuries, property damage, pollution, and the original cause of the Ever Forward running aground is unknown. For 5 weeks it was trapped in the mud. Since it was outside the shipping canal, marine traffic was not completely interrupted. The same thing cannot be said for the Evergreen, the Ever Forward's sister. The Evergreen's grounding in the Suez Canal in 2021 attracted attention from all over the world. It was an expensive accident that stopped ship travel for a week and shut down a majority of the global supply chain. Number 4. Tesla Dad. At the beginning of 2023, a Tesla drove off Devil's Slide, a dangerous cliff in Northern California. Before plunging to the rocks below, it flipped a few times and ultimately landed upright. It barely missed the Pacific Ocean. The occupants of the car, a married couple and their 2 small children, miraculously survived the 300-foot fall. Despite their survival, the parents needed to be hospitalized and get treated for their injuries, though they weren't life-threatening. Children weren't even harmed. Police and multiple emergency response teams, as well as a helicopter, helped with the rescue. In most survival situations, people would say the survivors are lucky. But what if the accident could have been avoided altogether in the first place? Not long after the fall, neighbors, family, and friends learned the truth behind the family's accident. The California Highway Patrol claims that the wreck was intentional. A husband and father, Dharmesh A. Patel, was placed under arrest while at the hospital. He's now under suspicion for child abuse and several attempted murders. It wasn't reported what led authorities to come to this conclusion, but they guaranteed the decision was justified. By law, arrested patients remain in the hospital until their medical release. At that point, they're charged and sent to jail to either await trial or get bail set. Patel's hospitalization buys the DA's office more than enough time to review police reports, which will determine whether or not Patel will be charged as a criminal. As of January 9, 2023, Patel remained at the hospital under 24-hour close supervision. People who know the family were shocked to hear of the intentional wreck. Patel, a radiologist in California, was the picture-perfect family man, doting, good to neighbors, friends, and family, and even a respected doctor. A neighbor described the Patels as the nuclear family. A motive has not been released, which leaves everyone wondering, why would a man with such a picture-perfect life drive over a cliff with his family inside? What was going on behind the scenes? Number 3. Elon Musk's $1 million McLaren. By now, everyone has heard of Elon Musk. He's a man ahead of his time, with a remarkable track record thanks to his genius inventions. With projects such as Tesla, SpaceX, and Hyperloop, there's no doubt that Musk likes things that are efficient and fast. After receiving a degree in physics and science at the University of Pennsylvania, he continued his study at Stanford, but he dropped out to start a software company with his brother. In 1999, they sold the business to Compaq for $300 million. Musk then turned around and immediately purchased a $1 million McLaren F1. For the next year or so, he used it every day and racked up over 11,000 miles. In 2000, Musk was driving to a meeting in Palo Alto, California with his friend Peter Thiel. Elon himself admitted that he didn't know what he was doing when it came to driving the speedy car. Despite that, he wanted to show off after Thiel asked what the car could do. With a cheeky grin, Musk said, "Watch this." Elon then slammed his foot down. As they were going down the road at incredibly high and illegal speeds, Musk tried to switch lanes. The McLaren had no traction control though, which caused the rear wheels to fly off, sending his car into an uncontrolled spin. The $1 million vehicle went soaring into the air before slamming nose first into an embankment. Interestingly, the car landed in the same position it was before the crash, except it had some minor physical differences. The suspension on the car was totally wrecked, the windshield was smashed to bits, and the wheels were nowhere in sight. On the bright side, the wreck was no match for the mega-rich billionaire. After stopping, Musk just started laughing and said to Thiel, "Wow, Peter, that was really intense." As he was calming down, he explained to Thiel that he'd never insured the McLaren. Musk confirmed in their interviews that he didn't have auto insurance, but never said why. Most think it's because anyone wealthy enough to buy a $1 million car in cash can more likely than afford to pay out of pocket for repairs if needed. Not wanting to be late for the fundraising meeting they were supposed to attend, Musk and Thiel simply stuck out their thumbs and hitched a ride. Amazingly, he was able to get the vehicle repaired, but he later sold it in 2007 because he had an image to uphold as the CEO of multiple companies and didn't want people writing about him having a high-performance sports car. Would you get car insurance as a billionaire? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe while you're down there. Number 2. Deliberate train wrecks. Usually when we think of cars crashing into each other, monster trucks or demolition derbies come to mind. But people from the late 19th and early 20th centuries had something completely different planned. Starting in 1896, crowds developed the strange yet beloved hobby of watching staged train wrecks. And these bizarre events lasted for over 40 years. William George Crush was the mastermind behind the event called Crash at Crush. He was an employee at the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, or Katy Railroad for short, a company that was financially suffering as a result of the Panic of 1893. He was handed the responsibility of finding ways to lure new customers to the railroad tracks. To get things going for the event, William created his temporary namesake town, Crush. He expected about 20,000 people or so to show up by traveling on the Katy Railroad. To support that many people, he drilled water wells, built a makeshift restaurant, and even made sure to include a wooden jail in case anyone got out of line. But to his shock, almost 40,000 attendees came to watch the crash. By 5:10 p.m. on the day of the first event, Crash at Crush was underway. After getting the signal, an engineer in each train pulled the throttles back as far as they could possibly go, which got the trains up to full speed. Then, they jumped off the locomotives just in time to avoid the collision. Guests were on the edge of their seats as they witnessed the two old steam trains barreling towards each other on the same track at 50 miles an hour. Crush wasn't prepared for the aftermath of the wreck. Upon impact, both boilers exploded, which sent wreckage flying everywhere. Many people were injured by stray metal shards. One person even lost an eye. The results of the crash didn't seem to faze the guests, though. When the show was over, the wreckage was combed through by visitors hoping to go home with a lucky souvenir. Crush was fired from the railroad company after the crash since it cost 2 people their lives. But after learning how successful the event was, Katy Railroad rehired him the next day. From there, a man turned staging train collisions into a lifelong career. Between 1896 and 1932, Joe Connolly, or Head-On Joe, staged over 70 wrecks. That's 146 destroyed trains. His shows were put on all throughout the country. He went from Boston to LA and from Tampa to Salt Lake City, Utah. He was known for really putting on a show. One of his specialties was attaching dynamite to the front of the trains and putting gasoline in the freight cars behind the engines. This caused vehicles to erupt into flames after the derailment. Painting the names of political candidates on the side of the trains in order for passengers to cheer on their preferred locomotive was another strategy for attracting bigger crowds. The Hoover versus Roosevelt was one example of a popular crash in 1932. The attraction surrounding the crashes declined by the 1930s. It was the height of the Great Depression, a terrible time to be wasteful and destroy trains, especially since they were still functional, just old. In 1932, Connolly performed his last crash at the Iowa State Fair. He reportedly remarked, "Well, that's that," and left after the damaging but spectacular performance. And at number 1, Arctic crash. Sergei Anailov, a Russian helicopter pilot, was almost the first person to fly around the world using a helicopter weighing less than 2,204 pounds. As day 42 of his trip approached, he only had 4,000 miles left to go. Sadly, his trip was cut short after one of the belts in his engine snapped and sent his helicopter plummeting into the Davis Strait between Greenland and Nunavut. During the descent, his blades were still spinning. Within 30 seconds, Sergei's chopper was at the bottom of the strait. His satellite phone, a distress beacon, and all his trackers were with it. Albeit soaking wet, he had a survival suit that he'd only worn from his bottom half, a life raft, 3 flares, and a small stash of protein bars. For the next 2 days, he clung to a 65-foot chunk of ice, fighting for his life. Anailov stayed under his life raft for the rest of the day. Within a few hours, he heard heavy breathing. As he looked up, a polar bear had walked right to him from across the ice. Angry at the situation he was in, the man jumped up and started roaring at the bear, waving his arms around wildly. He was certain that the bear wanted to eat him, and this would be his last moments in life. The bear turned and walked away, but wanted to make a lasting point. Sergei chased the creature all the way to the edge of the block of ice, and he didn't stop until he lost sight of it. The next morning, 2 planes flew past. They were oblivious to the flares Sergei launched because of the dense fog. He received visits from 2 other polar bears in the meantime. He stated that he could tell they were 3 different bears by the way they responded to him. Sergei reasoned that if the visits were from the same animal, it would have grown less frightened and more persistent each time. Later that evening, his encounter with polar bears came to an end. Thanks to the fog clearing up, an icebreaker crew saw the last flare Sergei fired. He was unharmed and able to reconnect with his family and friends despite the accident and 32 hours that followed. While he acknowledged that it could be difficult to win his family over, he expressed a desire to continue pursuing his goal and try to make it around the world again. He said in an interview, "But on my knees I must beg them to let me do it again and again." Thanks for watching. What are some crazy vehicle accidents you've heard of? Please let us know. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.